Excellent. Welcome all. This is an event that is within the initiative designed by the Minorities in Economics Committee to display recent important research on issues related to, again, minorities in economics, discrimination, and in particular ethnicity in this case. And the idea of this series, once again, is that not only it is important to increase awareness on this type of topics within the profession, but it is also important to get more people to work on these topics. So there is a double objectives in this. And in particular, for the audience, in case you want to spread these things later on even more, all these events are being recorded. And so for someone who expressed some interest later on, there's always a possibility to point them to the website of the MinE on the EA website, where all such presentations are kept. So we now have Sigrid Suetens talking to us about ethnic salience and discrimination. And feel free to interrupt anytime. We like the open questions format. Go ahead, Sigrid.
Okay, thanks so much, Massimo. Thanks a lot for inviting me to give this presentation. Yes, so as you said, right, so the title of the paper is Ethnic Salience and Discrimination, and it's joint work with Zara Murad from Portsmouth, Emel Öztürk, and Yi Sheng, who are also at Tilburg University. So let me give you an introduction where this all started. So in general, we all know that there's quite a bit of ethnic discrimination. This has been shown already in plenty of academic studies that have been conducted on the labor market, the housing market, trade, the judicial system, and so on. Now, in economics, we typically use a framework where we identify discrimination as either due to taste, so taste-based discrimination, or due to statistics, which is referred to as statistical-based discrimination or stereotypes. And whether discrimination is driven by statistics or taste is actually important for the design of policies and for welfare analysis. The difference between the two is as follows, right? So with statistical discrimination, people basically discriminate because they rely on kind of decision-making under uncertainty. So, for example, if an employer has to decide whom to hire, then, often, of course, this person does not have all the information about potential employees, how productive they will be, how productive they have been in the past, and so on. So what people often do in this context is to rely on general statistics that they are familiar with. That can be either accurate or inaccurate, but the point is that it's a general statistic. So it's very rational then to kind of rely on this information to make a specific choice. And if that then leads to a certain group being discriminated against, meaning in this context not being hired, then that's what is referred to as statistical discrimination. In the case of taste-based discrimination, it's actually quite different, right? So in the sense that even if the employer has all the information that he or she needs about future productivity, I mean, consider this as a thought experiment, and then still discriminates against a specific group, then that is what is referred to as taste-based discrimination. Now, as you can already imagine, looking at the example of the employer of hiring decisions, it is very difficult empirically to identify whether discrimination is actually due to taste or statistics, because productivity is typically unobservable. So that's why there's a role for controlled economic experiments, and experiments have then also been relied upon to study basically whether taste-based discrimination is an important phenomenon. So yes, what is the advantage of experimentation or of implementing controlled lab experiments to investigate this topic? The point is that in experiments, it's possible to switch on and off the risk related to the productivity of strategic partners. Consider, for example, a context where you are simply faced with simple choices. You know, there's no strategic uncertainty whatsoever. The productivity of a potential relational partner doesn't matter for your own profits. Well, in this case, if you actually make sure or make choices such that the payoff of the other person is actually lower if that person belongs to a certain minority group than if that person belongs to the same group as the decision maker, well, in that case, you can say, well, if you observe discrimination, then we have identified it as taste-based discrimination. So because of this advantage, so that it is at least possible to come closer to the identification of taste-based discrimination than it is with empirical data that occur in natural environments, experiments have become a widespread tool to study and identify taste-based discrimination. I've listed on the slides a couple of examples of seminal papers, but there's many more papers that followed this approach, basically. So in general, it's important to understand what we can learn from such experiments. And that's basically what this paper is about. So the paper is not a typical experimental paper where you know, there's a pre-registration plan that is being followed and so on. But the paper builds on certain patterns that we have observed in past experiments that were basically designed for different reasons, not to study this question in specific, but where we've seen some patterns and we put them all together into one paper, basically.
This train terminates.
I'm sorry, but I'm hearing some background noises here from some, I don't know. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, so it's important to understand what we can learn from these experiments, right? That's how you should see. Right, so so this paper is about the effect of ethnic issue salience on ethnic discrimination as is measured in lab in the field experiments, basically. So what is ethnic issue salience? Well, first of all, issue salience in general refers to an issue being generally salient to the public during a specific period of time. For example, think of the Me Too crisis, the Me Too movement, think of the refugee crisis, the Black Lives Matter movement, and so on. So issue salience has been shown in the sociology literature and political science to be a key component in voting models. So it correlates with voting behavior. And typically how it is measured is basically by media coverage. Now, so what do? What we do in this paper is we merge data from 3 different lab in the field experiments that were designed to study certain aspects of taste-based discrimination, and that happen to have some naturally occurring variation in ethnic salience. And the ethnic salience is basically varies between, you know, within the experiments due to the differences in timing of the different waves. So I'll tell you all about that later on. So how to think of these experiments, right? So the 3 experiments have a number of features in common. And that's the reason why we think it's really important to put all the results together, basically in one paper. So first of all, the participants from the general population make incentivized choices that affect others. So that's the case for all 3 experiments, right? It's general population samples. The second point is that the decision makers are all from a native majority group, right? Either in the Netherlands or in the UK. And the choices of the decision makers, they affect a vulnerable participant. So what does it mean, vulnerable participant? It means that that person basically undergoes the choice of someone else. So basically does not have an influence, him or herself, on her payoff, or at least not the final call. It doesn't have the final call. That's one aspect of vulnerability. Another aspect is that that participant can also never earn more, basically, than the decision maker, or that will never occur. Then a third aspect that is similar across all, or the same across all the 3 experiments, is that there is treatment variation in the ethnic background of the vulnerable participant. So in half of the treatments, the vulnerable participant has an ethnic minority background. In other half of the treatments, this vulnerable participant is from the same group as a decision maker, right? So also from the native majority. And then a fourth element is that there's variation in ethnic salience that is generated by the timing of the experimental waves. So which is either low or high, as you will see also later in the talk. So let me now go through all the experiments one by one and what is specific of each experiment. Right, so the first experiment is what we call, we abbreviate as NL1. So that's an experiment that was run in the Netherlands with the LIS panel. And that's basically a panel that, in which more than 6,000-7,000 people participate every year in surveys. And now and then they also participate in experiments. So in the panel, there's, or in this experiment, the decision makers all have a native Dutch background, and they make 3 reciprocation choices in the role of trustee in a trust game. So basically, the design is the one that we used in a previous paper that's already published. And think of basically as a trustee, you're faced with a trust choice. So someone, the trustor who trusted you, and then you decide whether to reciprocate this trust or not. Remember that all the trustees, they're native Dutch, and then the trustors, so the first movers in the trust game, they are either native Dutch as well. And this is what we then refer to as the majority treatment. Or the trustors have a non-Western immigration background, which is what we refer to as the minority treatment. And the migration background, or in general, the ethnic background, is signaled through the first name. I mean, this is in the Netherlands, pretty clear, a very clear signal of the ethnic background. Now, in terms of the level of ethnic salience, so the timing of the waves, so the very first wave of this experiment was run in December 2014. That's what we refer to as the low ethnic salience wave. And then the high ethnic salience waves, there's actually 2 different high ethnic salience waves that we use here in this paper. So the first one occurred or was conducted in February 2015. And that's basically right after the attack at the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris by Al-Qaeda, terrorist attack. And then the second high salience wave was run in December 2015, which was basically in the midst of the European refugee crisis. Okay, so that's basically that is what defines the variation in ethnic salience. That's the difference in timing between these waves. Then let me continue to the UK experiment. So the UK experiment was also run on a general population of people residing in the UK. Here we use prolific. And here, basically, all the decision makers were white, and they made a range of redistribution choices that affected the payoff of a pair of recipients who before had made a risky investment, and they either ended up with 0 or with the amount of the investment tripled. So basically, they were either unlucky or lucky with their investment. Also here, so we have, but here the difference is that the decision maker is himself or herself. There's basically no consequences to the direct payoff, so no direct consequences to him or herself.
Sigrid?
Yes, please.
I was just thinking that this setup here with the trustor, the trustee, etc., could also be used as a side comment to test the social identification theories of Bonomici, Naioli, Tabellini, right? Because there seems to be a similar setup. It's just a suggestion for future work.
Yes, I will definitely look into that. Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sigrid, may I ask a question, please?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
I was wondering, so when you say that naturally occurring ethnic salience, and we talk about Je suis Charlie or European refugee crisis, so where does the cross-sectional variation only comes from one of the persons being either native or non-native, right? So there is, otherwise everyone is getting treated at the same time by Je suis Charlie. There is no control group at that point, right? So it's over time.
In terms of the salience, yes. So basically, within each wave, we have 2 treatments, depending on the background of the vulnerable participant, basically, right? So the participant who is affected by the choices of the decision maker. And that person either has an ethnic minority background or the same background as the decision maker. So that is conducted in each wave. So that's basically, if you want, what is kind of a proxy that we're going to use for taste-based discrimination, the difference between ultimately the payoffs that both earn, basically, the difference in payoff between the treatments. But the ethnic salience, that is basically a natural variation, right? That is due to the timing of the wave. I'm going to show you, after I have shown the 3 different experiments, I'm going to show you a graph. Yeah, that kind of shows, you know, how people have searched in Google and kind of to underscore, let's say, our assumptions on the occurrence of ethnic salience.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so in the UK experiment, we had then, okay, so remember there was one person who could win and one who could lose basically the amount of the investment. So we had pairs of a white loser and a non-white winner. This is what we will refer to as the majority treatment, right? Because here the vulnerable person is the one who lost the money, has the same ethnic background as a decision maker, white. And then the other treatment, the minority treatment, has a pair with a non-white loser and a white winner. So here, the low ethnic salience condition refers to waves that were run before the global spread of the Black Lives Matter movement in June 2020. And high ethnic salience refers to waves that were run right after these protests. So these high salience waves were run in July 2020. And additionally, on Prolific, there was actually this slider that you can see on the slides. So we're standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. We'll match your donations to anti-racism organizations until the 17th of June. So at the point that they participated in our study, that slider was gone, but probably many of the participants saw that slider just a few weeks before they participated in our experiments in the high salience wave. Recall also that here, in terms of the valence, if you want, this is very different from the first experiment. So here, basically, the whites, so the majority people are generally seen as the culprits, whereas the minorities are the victims here. And that's kind of the different in the first experiment, where, yes, there was an attack on the majority population, I mean, from the point of view of the majority decision makers in that experiment. Okay, so then let me go to the third experiment, which we refer to as NL2. So that was also run in the Netherlands, again with a list panel. And here, native Dutch decision makers made a range of allocation choices. So basically, like a bit more than 40 choices that affected their own payoff, and then the payoff of an anonymous recipient, who is then the vulnerable participant, right? So that recipient was either native Dutch, that's what we refer to as the majority treatment, or was a second-generation immigrant with Turkish or Moroccan parents, which is what we refer to as a minority treatment. And again, here, there was a signal through the first name. So here, in terms of ethnic salience, so next to the timing of the waves, there's actually another variation in salience that goes in the same direction. Specifically in the high ethnic salience waves, so except for the fact that they were run right after the BLM protests, we also included information about the recipient parent's birthplace, right? Which was either the Netherlands, Turkey, or Morocco. But that made it, of course, additionally salient who was actually this recipient, right? And especially in relation to the ethnic background of the recipient. And then in the low ethnic salience waves, they were run about 4 months after the first waves. We did not have this information, and that was also run like 4 months, of course, after BLM, where, yes, the ethnic salience related to that was lower, or BLM already kind of disappeared a little bit from the media. So let me then now show you the promised graph of Google search of ethnicity-related topics. So it starts in January 2010 and goes until July 21. So the red line indicates the Netherlands and the blue line the UK. So basically what you see here is a proxy for a popularity of ethnicity-related topics, right? And the search term you can see here, it's a mix of search terms in different variations. They're not all included here, but that's basically how to think of it. So if you look here at the very first wave that we ran of the Netherlands experiments, right, NL1, so that was run in December 2014, in a period, let's say, where ethnic salience was relatively low compared to what you can see afterwards. Then was the Charlie Hebdo attack, that's this peak here. And then right after, we ran our second wave of this experiment. Then a bit later in the year 2015, there was the refugee crisis. And then in December 2015, we ran our third wave of the NL1 experiment. Okay, then we have for the UK experiment, the first two waves were also run in a period with relatively low ethnic salience, right? As you can see here in the graph. Then was the murder of George Floyd, end of May 2020. And then as a consequence, the Black Lives Matter movement, or at least the global spread of this movement. I mean, it already existed before, but it really got globally well known in this period. So then we ran right afterwards, we ran the UK wave 3, and then also the first wave of the second Dutch experiment was also run a little bit afterwards. And then several months afterwards, we had the second wave of that last experiment, right? So this is just kind of underscoring how we define ethnic salience, right? And we provide some evidence here based on like a very popular search engine, right? Okay. So the research question, I guess, is clear at this point. So what is the effect of ethnic salience on choices that affect individuals with a minority background and ultimately on ethnic discrimination? And then an important part of the paper will also be to discuss mechanisms behind the effect, right? So what is the empirical strategy?
I have another question. So when we think about minorities and ethnic salience, does it matter which minorities are getting salient? And in the sense that, suppose when we talk about Black Lives Matter, can we expect spillover for Hispanics, for example, or either positive or negative, or is it very specific to who is getting salient, and it's just we have to think about those people as the victims or the perpetrators of whatever the salience is?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. So what we are looking at here is, I think, a pretty close match to kind of, let's say, what is like the topic, if you want, of the ethnic salience, like which group is more salient, and then also the type of group that is here affected in the experiment. So at least in this case, there is a very close match. So I don't think we can say much about, you know, how other groups are affected. I don't think we can say much about that on the basis of these experiments.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
Because we really focus on those groups. The reason why in the Dutch experiments we had these groups is because it's the largest minority groups in the Netherlands. And then in the UK, there, of course, non-white is, of course, broader than Black. So in that sense, maybe there's other groups that are affected as well, but we cannot say anything in specific about them.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, so the empirical strategy, so we're gonna just define one variable that is comparable across the 3 experiments, and that's basically the earnings share of the vulnerable minority participants, right? So is the standardized share of earnings of that participant in the sum of earnings of the pair. So if you want, you can see that as a proxy for the degree of pro-sociality towards the vulnerable participants, okay? There's identification as assumptions here, right? So of course, I mean, it's experimental data, but of course the variation in ethnic salience, that's not experimental. So a first important assumption is that the sample is balanced between high and low ethnic salience waves. So I'm gonna show you some balancing tables, and that seems all okay. The second point is that ethnic salience does not affect pro-sociality in general, or there's no specific time trend in pro-sociality. And here we can also do a lot, right? Because we also know how pro-sociality towards a majority vulnerable participants evolves over time, or response to ethnic salience. So what we're ultimately going to focus on is the diff in diff effect, right? Are minority participants affected differently than majority participants? And third, there's no other factors apart from ethnic salience that have systematically affected pro-sociality towards individuals of the minority group in these countries and in these periods of study. And here, basically one factor that, I mean, has also been pretty salient is basically COVID. And if anything, what we find from other papers on this topic is that, yes, the hostility towards minority groups, especially then maybe East Asian groups, has increased due to COVID, right? It definitely is not going to in the same direction as a result that you will see. But you know, if there's any comments on this or suggestions that we can do more, you know, please tell me after I show you the results. That will be really interesting. Okay, so let me show you very quickly some balancing tables. So this is for the Netherlands. I mean, it's a lot of numbers. I'm not going to go through all of them, obviously. So we have the vulnerable participant is either from the minority group or from the majority group. Remember, right? Decision makers are all majority, and vulnerable participants are from minority group or majority group. So this means that the treatment allocation to minority or majority is random, right? So this is random. So there should not be a difference between minority and majority. I also didn't put anything statistical test results on this slide here, but the p-values, they refer to the differences between the high salience wave and a low salience wave each time. So basically what you see overall is that there's no substantial or like by far no differences in terms of many of the background characteristics of the majority decision makers, right? So those are characteristics of the decision makers. So they're the percentage of male, age distribution, personal income, whether they are willing to vote for the far right, education, and so on, is all very, very similar in the high and ethnic and low ethnic salience waves. Then for the UK, we have like a similar conclusion, basically. There's not much of a difference, except in terms of the municipality population size. So we have a little bit of an oversampling of smaller municipalities in the high ethnic salience waves. So you can see that here and here versus here and here. So here we do get a significant, statistically significant difference between high and low. So it's going to be important to include these variables as control variables in the regressions later on, right? And then finally, our NL2 experiments, no differences here as well, right? So the waves are very much balanced in terms of the variables that we can observe. Okay, so then let me show you the main results first. So what I'm showing you here is the regressions where the dependent variable is the earning share of the vulnerable participant if this participant has a minority background. And I'm showing you here the results for the 3 experiments, NL1 UK and NL2, and then each time without and with control variables, right? So basically what to look at is this here. So this is showing you the effect of high ethnic salience on the earning share of the vulnerable participant. And as you can see, you see a strong positive effect across the 3 experiments, right? So it seems that the decision makers have become more pro-social, or at least seemingly more pro-social towards minority participants across the 3 experiments due to high ethnic salience, right? Now, let me then show you on the next slides how things look if the vulnerable participant has a majority background, right? To show you that this is kind of the control group, if you want. And here we don't see anything, right? So we don't see that there's any effect of salience, ethnic salience on the earning share of the vulnerable participant if the vulnerable participant is part of the majority. Then finally, the diff in diff. right? So for the 3 experiments, you can see that it's strongly positive. It's qualitatively positive, but we don't get statistical significance for the 3rd experiment of the diff-in-diff effect. So the interaction between having a minority background and being in the high ethnic salience wave, but we do get the statistical significance for the 2 other experiments, right? In general, basically, there's kind of an increase in pro-sociality towards minority participants, whereas we do not observe the same increase towards majority participants.
Sorry, isn't it a bit surprising that it didn't matter whether the perpetrators or the victims of the salience were different? Shouldn't we have expected the opposite effect, or maybe no effect for something? And
yes, I think, I mean, to be honest, like, yes. So we were very much at the start, we were very much puzzled by these results for NL1, right? Where, as you suggest, you know, maybe the intuitive hypothesis would be to expect the opposite. We did not, so we were very much puzzled by those results. And then by discovering basically the other effects, we decided, okay, we need to study this more, you know, in a deeper way and see whether we can learn something from putting all the results together. So your question brings me basically to the mechanisms, right? So let's see what the mechanisms are behind these effects. So maybe it's not genuine prosociality that is being measured, but, you know, some sort of biased form of prosociality. So I'm gonna definitely, hopefully, answer your question in the next slides when we get to the mechanisms. Yeah, so, right, how can the results be interpreted? So in general, there's maybe 3 main families of mechanisms. So the first one is that, sorry, ethnic salience has increased attention to the ethnic background. So if that is the case, it means that people who have already, let's say, a relatively pro-minority feeling or attitude, they will reinforce this attitude, whereas people who are on the other end maybe reinforce towards the other end. So you see more polarization. That is what you would expect if it's really, this effect is really driven by an increased attention to ethnic background. And of course, if there's more polarization, it could be that there's a little bit more, you know, going in one direction than in the other. So that's the first family of mechanisms. The second one is that, you know, the ethnic salience has actually changed social preferences, and people really got more pro-social towards these specific groups, minority groups. The third interpretation is that it has strengthened social desirability bias. Okay, so let me now show you a range of things that we do in order to discover what is the more plausible mechanism. Right. So the good thing of the list sample is that we have a lot of background information about the individuals who participate. We, for example, know their voting preference. We even know how they evolve over time. So we can do quite a bit to get into the mechanisms here. Okay, so first, the increased attention, right? So as I said, basically, if that's the explanation, we should see more polarization. And here we can exploit the availability of attitudes towards ethnic diversity in society, which is measured in the Lies core survey on politics and values. We can only do this for the Dutch experiments, not for the UK. So we do it in the simplest possible way. Basically, we divide individuals in 2 groups based on self-reported attitudes to ethnic diversity, which were measured before our experiment took place. And we test whether they respond differently to high ethnic salience, right? So we should see basically, I'm really sorry that I have to show this, but I'm going to show you some triple interaction regression results. But you know, it's relatively easy to interpret. But basically, here comes an additional variable which we call pro-diversity, and this variable is equal to 1. It's a binary variable if people score above the median on the self-reported attitude to ethnic diversity. Okay, so we should.
Sigrid?
Yes, please.
So here you divided in 2 groups, right?
Yes.
I was wondering whether you could try to split in 3 groups, because I've done a recent paper with various co-authors called In Medio Stat Virtus. You can find it on my website, where we have seen that there is a sort of general pattern in terms of responsiveness, greater responsiveness to information treatments and the like. This was not in a lab experiment, it was more in a field experiment, but yet in the middle, right? Because like rather than thinking necessarily about polarization, it could be that those that are at the extreme on whatever dimension that you have information of, you know, left, right, or education, whatever, maybe are harder to move from their priors, whereas those that are actually in the middle may be more movable in their priors.
Okay, yes, we can definitely do that. And
Yeah.
yes, we will do that. Absolutely. Yeah, haven't thought about that before. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yes, so let me show you what we get if we have the two groups only. So, well, first of all, what I'm going to show you here is this triple interaction model where we simply interact with this pro-diversity dummy variable. And the dependent variable is, again, the earning share of the vulnerable participants. So if if polarization is kind of the main mechanism, or, you know, attention, then it means that this triple interaction needs to be positive and significant, right? So let's have a look how that goes. So for the Dutch experiment 1, NL1, we see that it's actually negative, not statistically significant, but definitely not positive. For the NL2 experiment, we do see that it's positive. It doesn't reach statistical significance, but at least, you know, it seems that for the second experiment, it could be part of the story, right? But definitely not for the first experiment. So in general, I don't think we can conclude that polarization is the explanation for the results that we find. So then we go to the second question, right, or the second mechanism. In a sense, is basically the question is whether the shift is due to genuine preferences. You know, supposing now that in general it's not really due to attention or the difference in attention, it should be then due to a shift in genuine preferences, in genuine prosociality, or in some kind of effect of social desirability bias. So also here we can do quite a bit. So as I said, for the Netherlands, we have panel data from the LIS. And we have panel data on political preferences between 2010 and 2015. So basically the period that is of interest that we can cover here. So this attitude variable, we can observe that every year, except in 2014, it was actually missing. We also have data on the intention to vote for the far right. And each time these variables are measured in December, right? But not in 2014, as I said. So remember maybe the Google search graph. What we can now say is basically that we have here in these data, we basically have one high ethnic salience wave. That's the 2015 survey. And then everything that comes before, we can label as low ethnic salience, right? So what we can do is individual fixed effects regressions, where we study then the effect of high salience on political preferences. And that's what we then do. And let's have a look at the results here. So we have two dependent variables. The first one is this pro-diversity index based on attitudes to ethnic diversity. And the second one is the intention to vote for the far right. So that's the binary variable. So as you can see here, if anything, the effect goes in the other direction. Right.
Sorry,
so
can you please remind us how the pro-diversity index was calculated again? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, maybe actually I didn't tell you about the details here. So basically it's composed of 6 questions that relate to attitudes to ethnic diversity in society. Like questions like how much, you know, do you think immigrants are important for the economy? How, you know, related to how asylum seekers should be treated. And they basically are answered on a 7-point scale, and they are then all merged in an index. So that's this pro-diversity. You can see the detailed questions in the paper, but that's how it's compiled, basically.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, you're welcome. So more positive is pro-diversity, and lower is against ethnic diversity. So as you see here, right, there's a negative effect of high ethnic salience on the pro-diversity index and a positive effect on voting for the far right. So if anything, the attitudes and the feelings of people towards people with a minority background have gone the other direction than what we observed in the experiment. So that's one thing. For the UK, we also have some information. So we collected data about political preferences in post-experimental questionnaires, so that people answered right after they participated in the experiment. And here I didn't put that on the slides because, you know, there's really no effect at all of high ethnic salience on what they report in these data, right? So also here on the basis of the UK data, there's, doesn't seem to be the case that, you know, the political preferences go in line with the behavior. That doesn't seem to be the case. Then another thing, another variable that we have from the LIS data is actually a proxy that psychologists have used for proneness to social desirability, right? So the idea here, I mean, you know, in the end, experiments, like a big advantage of experiments has always been that there's incentives, right? They're incentivized. There's something at stake. And this has been shown to reduce social desirability bias, right? That's a famous Levitt and List paper. However, also here, it may be that, like, if you feel observed, then there may still be an effect here, right? And that can actually increase social desirability bias. And given that discrimination, ethnic discrimination is obviously, you know, people do not want to be perceived as someone who discriminates. There could be an interpretation of the findings here that because of the high ethnic salience, they in some way feel more observed or are more aware of this fact. And this makes them be nicer or more pro-social towards minorities than they would otherwise have been. So that's what we mean with the effect of, or the mechanism of social desirability bias. And these data on what is called the Marlowe-Brown social desirability scale are also available in the LIS panel. So they assess the extent to which one associates with personality traits that can basically be too good to be true. We only have those for the Dutch data also. And also here we can do this triple interaction exercise, right? So we basically, do I have maybe the, yes, this is the social desirability test, basically. So just to give you an idea about what these statements are. So the first statement, I never hesitate to go out of my way to help someone in trouble. And then you have to indicate whether you agree or not for yourself. I have never intensely disliked anyone. I can't remember praying sick to get out of something, and so on, right? So basically, people who always answer the social desirability answer, they are either angels or they pretend to be angels, right? So that's the idea of this test. Yes, and what we do is we divide the decision makers into two groups. So again, based on the median of this score, so people with a high score we call social desirable, the binary indicator, and then people with a low score, they are part of the control group here. So here, I'm going to show you again these triple interaction regressions, where the dependent variable is the earning share of the vulnerable participant. And if social desirability bias is an important mechanism, then again here, the triple interaction should be positive, okay? So let me show you the results. Okay, so for the first experiment, so the NL1 experiment, what we see is that this is indeed the case, right? So we have here a significantly positive triple interaction, which means that those people who score high on the social desirability test, they are the ones who respond to the high salience, right? But that only holds for the first experiment for the LN1, but not for the NL2. Now you can say that, okay, maybe the social desirability bias is also not a general explanation. However, there is more going on here. So what we find if you look, for example, at this finding here, right, you see that for the first experiment, NL1, you see that those people who discriminated in the first place in the low ethnic salience wave, those were actually the ones who also pretend to be very, very pro-social in this social desirability test. Okay. Whereas that's not the case in the second experiment. You see that already in the second experiment in NL2, already in the low ethnic salience wave, there is actually this effect of social desirability bias, namely those people who are very prone to social desirability bias are more pro-social towards minority in the first place. So our interpretation of this combination of findings is that in this second experiment, you know, there was already a basic proneness to social desirability bias, even without the salience. And then if you add ethnic salience on top of it, there's nothing else. I mean, nothing in addition that is happening here. So, okay, so that's the social desirability bias. So let me very quickly give you an overview of how we see these mechanism results. So first of all, the increased attention to ethnicity, we find partial evidence for it, right, in one of the experiments. We do not find that there is, I mean, or at least there's no suggestions in the data that the result that we find is due to a change in genuine preferences. And third, there is definitely something in the data that connects to social desirability bias, right? So that's our conclusion for the mechanisms here. Then a further interpretation. So, okay, let's assume, okay, you know, people are more aware maybe that they're part of an experiment. So what we did now to study this in more detail is to see whether the awareness of being part of a study on ethnic discrimination on its own, whether that can actually change people's attitude or behavior towards ethnic minorities. So we did an additional experiment on this in November 2022 on a fresh sample from the LIS data. And here we only measured prosociality towards a minority partner, okay? So in a cross-sectionally, basically. So here the difference in salience, if you want, does not come from a difference in timing. But we have a baseline treatment and an information treatment. So the baseline is as before. There's basically no information that the study in which they take part is about discrimination. They do know, however, that they are taking part in academic research. In the information treatment, they, in addition, know that the study is about discrimination. So we tell them the following piece of information. The study is about discrimination. It is being studied whether people with a Turkish or Moroccan background are treated differently than people with a Dutch background. What we find is basically that there's no effect of this treatment, right? So we do find a difference in beliefs. So the manipulation check is positive, if you like. So people are more likely to believe that the research is about ethnic discrimination in information than in baseline. However, we do not see a difference in the earnings share of the minority, okay? So awareness of the research topic on its own is not part of the social desirability mechanism that explains the result. But in a recent paper that I actually discovered a few weeks ago, it seems that, you know, in correspondence studies where people are aware that they're part of an academic research, you see a different behavior than in correspondence studies where people do not know, right? So just the main fact that you know that you're part of research can already be enough to generate differences in discrimination, less discrimination in the study that I just mentioned.
Sorry, both. So in the baseline and in this follow-up, do you actually ask them that how is the question framed? Do you know what this is about, or do you know this is research, or do you know what this is? Do they get options? And then
no, they don't get options. It's an open question. What do you think is the research? What do you think the research is about?
I see.
That's what we ask. Yeah. Yes, and on the basis of that, we had RAs doing coding of the answers and categorize the answers. And yes, we don't see, well, we see a difference in the answers, but we don't see a difference in the behavior.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so in the final few minutes, I also want to show you some quite remarkable effect that we found for the implicit association test. So that is a test that is being widely used in social psychology, and it's aimed at measuring implicit discrimination. And initially it was designed to overcome social desirability bias, right? So basically what you see, you need to press 2 keys on the keyboard. Maybe most of you are familiar with this test, but the crucial thing of the test is that it's based on response times, right? So you are asked to press certain keys on the keyboard, and then for people with, let's say, a discriminatory attitude, the idea would be that they would find it very difficult to connect positive words with the minority group that they would prefer to discriminate, right? Whereas if the positive words would be connected to their own group, then they find it easy to reply, and would also be faster to reply in the test. So that's kind of very briefly, the spirit of the test. And there's data available from Project Implicit of test takers all across the world, and also in the UK between December 2016 and May 23. So we looked at this data, and then, well, we first actually thought, okay, let's take this as a measure of genuine discrimination and see what happens. And then we found the following. So this is just an event study graph that shows you the results of this implicit association tests from, this 2017 to 23. And it's each time a half a year that is being covered, right? So each dot refers to 6 months of test results. What we find actually here, negative, by the way, means positive discrimination, and positive means negative discrimination. And the test results that I'm showing here are the results based on the race implicit association test. So white versus black. So what you see is that here, right after the Black Lives Matter movement spread globally, you see a serious drop in discrimination, basically, right? And then afterwards, things go a little bit back to the level before. So here's like, okay, very interesting. So basically, the test, the implicit association test, actually shows the same effect as we find in our experiment, right? Now, interestingly, so this test can actually be decomposed into 2 parts. Basically, a part that relates to the response times with respect to the compatible blocks, and a part that relates to the response times with respect to the incompatible blocks. I mean, compatible from the point of view of someone who would discriminate, right? So here I just repeat on this slide what is the ultimate test score is the time spent in the compatible blocks minus the time spent in the incompatible blocks, and then standardized by a standard deviation of the test taker's overall response time. So now what has been argued in the literature, and this test has been criticized for, like, this is one of the criticisms actually, is that, you know, it's actually really doable to, let's say, play this test, right? Because you can very easily increase your response time in the compatible blocks. I mean, you cannot decrease the response time in incompatible blocks, right? Decreasing one's response time or being much faster, that's very difficult. Whereas being slower with responding something, that's of course super easy. So basically there's 3 different effects if you want. So there could be selection effects that underlie the results that I just shown on the previous slides. Could be that people drop out, you know, the most prejudiced test takers, they drop out. Or it could be that a reduction in prejudice implies a decrease in the response time in the incompatible blocks, right? Basically a genuine change in prosociality towards the minority group, if you want. That's consistent. On the other hand, as I just said, right, an increase in social desirability bias, if you want to play the test, then this means that the response times increases in the compatible groups. And that's actually what we find, right? So if you kind of deconstruct the pattern of the implicit association test, what we see is that in both cases, compatible and incompatible, you see an increase in response times after Black Lives Matter, right? But you see actually that only in this case, well, maybe you can't see it in the graph, but in this case, the increase is larger in the compatible blocks than in the incompatible blocks, okay? So this makes us conclude that also for the change or the effect that we see in the implicit association test, it seems that that is possibly due to social desirability bias. Very similar to what we see in our experiments. So that's basically what I wanted to say. So let's conclude. So high ethnic salience induced people from the majority group to behave seemingly more pro-socially towards a minority partner. And we show evidence that it's most likely social desirability bias that is the key mechanism, and a little bit of attention also. Now, what does it mean? What do these results mean in general for the interpretation of behavior observed in experiments testing for taste-based discrimination? So the way we see it is that the experimental results can actually be seen as a lower bound for taste-based discrimination. So in general, we think it's really dangerous to interpret them as the level of taste-based discrimination. I don't think that's a very interesting interpretation. But that means basically that, you know, if a study doesn't show taste-based discrimination, I'm not sure how informative that is, right? So it's sometimes the conclusion has been made that this means that taste-based discrimination is really not an important phenomenon, but maybe we should be more careful with this conclusion and really see it as a lower bound. And then another implication is that experiments can be rethought, right, to detect taste-based discrimination. For example, one way of adjusting the experiments could be to include some moral wiggle room. Yes. So that's what I wanted to say. I want to thank you for your attendance and your comments and questions.
Thanks a lot. Anybody, any last question? In case not, I will take inspiration for thinking, and maybe other people might want to do the same, how one could try to replicate what we have done to try to distinguish these things with a slightly different design, of course, for other forms of discrimination, for other forms of minorities problems, right? On religion or disability, or obviously on LGBTQ, there are issues of non-visibility of the fact that one is a minority if he or she doesn't want, if they don't want to reveal it, and so on. So everything has to be readjusted, but I think it would be nice to replicate the experiment. Have you thought about it?
I haven't really thought about that, honestly, no. So yeah, in my research, I've been focusing a lot on ethnic discrimination, and I have still not completely understood what is exactly going on. So currently, that's what I'm now,
exactly.
on.
But in any case, it's inspirational. Thanks a lot, and
thank you.
We can stop the recording now and see you in March.
Okay, thanks a lot, Massimo. Thanks everyone for joining.
Very good. Thanks.
Bye.